Welcome to Florida Newsmakers. I'm Tramel Gomes with our very special guest, George Sheldon, former Secretary of the Florida Department of Children and Families and now Democratic nominee for Attorney General. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Glad to have you. I'd first like to say these candidate interviews are an opportunity for us to get a chance to get to know the candidates running for office, and we've extended the same invite to current sitting Attorney General Pam Bondi, and we look forward to having her on the program. But since you're here right now, let's get to you. You've had an accomplished history in public service. Just recently, the U.S. Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services.
Assistant Secretary.
So why have you decided to jump in and come back to Florida and run for Attorney General?
I've seen so much that an Attorney General's office can do. I was Deputy Attorney General to Bob Butterworth. I mean, Bob Butterworth was on the forefront of consumer protection, whether that was litigating against big tobacco and getting an $11 billion settlement for the state, or whether that was taking on the power companies, or whether that was taking on somebody like Miss Cleo, who was defrauding the public. The Attorney General office ought to be the people's lawyer. It's not the governor's lawyer. It's not the legislature's lawyer. It's the people's lawyer.
All right. So having been in the position as Deputy Attorney General, what's your view of how the office has been run for the last 4 years with your opponent?
Well, I give the incumbent credit for some of what she's done to really lead the parade on pill mills and human trafficking, although most of the activity was really done by others, by the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration on the case of pill mills, or by the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of Florida for human trafficking. But I think that office ought to be, as I indicated earlier, ought to be the consumer advocate. Every Attorney General in the state who's been in the state, dating back to Richard Irvin in the 60s, all the way through Bob Butterworth, Charlie Crist, including Bill McCollum, every Attorney General has intervened in utility rate increases, not this Attorney General. And that I find regrettable because we've got to have somebody trying to hold utility rates down. Duke Power, for instance, on the West Coast, has basically been charging customers a fee on a monthly basis for the construction of a nuclear power plant, a plant they're now not going to build. Where's the Attorney General in going to the Public Service Commission and saying those fees ought to be returned to citizens?
If you were in the office right now, what sort of issues, as you just mentioned, that would be one that you would be championing? What else would you be looking forward to tackling?
Let me give it. We just had a press conference this morning with victims of Johnson & Johnson's vaginal mesh. There are 100,000 women who've already filed lawsuits in this country about the vaginal mesh, which has done them great harm. And the stories they told about losing their jobs, losing their family, losing their home, that's what an Attorney General ought to do. And working with other Attorneys General around the country, this is the kind of thing that we ought to be working on in multi-state litigation to bring Johnson & Johnson to provide some recovery for these individuals.
You recently joined forces with some Republicans, moderate Republicans, in forming a bipartisan committee. What is this committee? What's the goal of this committee?
As I've traveled the state, I've seen so many Republicans who don't recognize their party anymore. The Republican Party used to be on the forefront of environmental protection, but they've turned their back on that, denying climate change. The Republican Party ought to be used to be on the forefront of human relations. They've turned their back on that. There's so many Republicans who don't recognize their party. Marianne Stiles, former general counsel to Associated Industries, feels that women's rights, particularly their rights to reproductive health, are under attack. Carlos de la Cruz feels very strongly about the cleanup of the Everglades. But it appears that this administration is paying more attention to stopping the cleanup of the Chesapeake Bay 1,000 miles from here, as opposed to focusing on the Everglades. Benton Becker was the general counsel to Gerald Ford, negotiated the Nixon pardon. He believes that we ought to be bringing people together. I firmly believe that the Attorney General ought to be above the partisan fray. ought to be the one moral pillar in government, bringing Republicans and Democrats and independents together. It's the way I operated as Secretary of the Department of Children and Families, the way I operated in Washington, and I think that's what the people of the state want.
Well, Mr. Sheldon, thank you so much for joining the program. As we said earlier, we extended the same invite to Attorney General Pam Bondi, and we look forward to having her on the program. And to our viewers, we'll catch you next time.